transform pain into possibilities, scars into songs, and silence into rhythm and meaning. This city, rich with history and alive with energy of generations past and present, has been a sanctuary for the dreamers, the freedom fighters, the poets, the artists, those who have shaped not just African identity but contributed immensely to the global story of resilience and hope. I today not just stand here as someone who's part of the United Nations, but I would like to share that I here stand before you as a Dalit woman from South Asia with shared lived experiences of my community, my ancestors, which is very, very similar to the people here in Africa. And I stand before you with humility of a witness, of one who has seen, heard, and been moved by the courage of countless people and communities who, despite centuries of denial, dispossession, and erasure, continue to raise their voice to demand repair, justice, and rightful place in history. And that is people of Africa and people of African descent. Nairobi itself has borne witness to both deepest wounds and the most uplifting songs of struggle. And from quiet, defiant whispers of liberation movement to the powerful resounding roars of Pan-African imagination and solidarity, this city embodies timeless narrative of survival and transformation. And it is only appropriate that we come together here at this Reparation Festival, Wakati Wetu. It's our time. This gathering is just not an event. It is a moment. It is a living confluence of historical memory, cultural expression, and demand of justice that refuse to be silenced. As the renowned South African artist William Kendridge once profoundly stated, the act of making art is act of making sense. And indeed, this is precisely what this festival accomplishes. It makes sense of history not through the pages of reports and documents alone, but through the vibrant pulse of rhythm, through boundless collective imagination, and through the shared breath of people refusing to be divided by their painful pasts. Here in music and dance, in storytelling and visual art, we transform fractured history of colonialism, enslavement, slavery, xenophobia, and oppression into narratives of resistance, healing, and hope. This festival reminds us all that justice is not only wielded in courtrooms or legislated in halls of power. It is a living, breathing process cultivated in spaces where communities gather to create, to dance, to sing, and to embody the very principles of reparative justice. It is fitting then that this festival's rhythm and voices are the language through which the most impacted reclaim the narrative, reshape collective memory, and reimagine a future rooted in dignity and equality. Now, coming to reparation, when we speak of reparation, we not only speak of compensation or restitution, we speak of restoration of dignity, truth, and justice woven back into the fabric of our societies. And reparation is not just settling of old accounts. There are many of my predecessors who have time and again reiterated about reparations and the significance of reparation in order to bring justice to people of African descent. And in this context, I quote one of my colleagues who says that reparation is a bridge between the past and the future, anchoring justice in memory and rebuilding trust in humanity. So the 2019 report by the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent made it clear that reparation are a matter of both individual and collective healing. It stated that reparation must be holistic, addressing physical, psychological, cultural, and spiritual harms resulting from enslavement and colonialism. Those harms do not exist in history books alone. They echo today in globalized inequities, in migration crisis, and in acts of xenophobia against people of African descent, Africans within and beyond the continent. And that is why we gather to remind the world that reparation are not just distant ideal, but a living demand, a commitment to resurrect justice where silence once lived. During my recent conversations, engagement with civil society groups, communities, activists, academicians, I've heard stories that remind us the new manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia. And this hatred towards other is now a new infection, and it is a remnant of unhealed colonial wounds. The 2022 report by my predecessor, Professor Tendai Achiume, she stressed on how old colonial ideologies continue to define belongings. It noted that migrants of African descent continue to be treated not just as bearers of culture, but carriers of threat. From Johannesburg to Tunis, from the Mediterranean crossing to urban corridors of Europe, the African identity too often becomes a fault line along with where fear is constructed. And yet, as an African proverb says, however long the night, the dawn will break. And in our movement towards reparation, the dawn is breaking slowly and defiantly. Today, what makes reparation festivals extraordinary, or the reparation conversation significant, is that it transforms justice into a living experience, and it is not trapped in policy language. It dances, paints, sings, and heals. And the reparation, often when we understand and analyze in the context of international human rights framework, it's often perceived in monetary terms, but at this moment reminds us that cultural reparations are equally important and significant, and it's important to reclaim our stories, language, memory, and identity in itself is as an act of repair and as an act of justice. Today, across UN system in the last many decades and in the near future, there is a strong consensus that reparation is not just symbolic, but needs to be translated into reality. The Human Rights Council 2021 resolution on promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence outlined 5 pillars essential for meaningful readdress: truth-telling and collective acknowledgement of wrongdoings, justice through institutional accountability, reparation through material and moral restoration, memory, preserving the voices of marginalized, guarantees of non-recurrence, so injustice do not reappear in new forms. These are not bureaucratic steps. They have to be deeply understood as a human commitment. In 2023, a report on reparatory justice, the Office of the UN High Commissioner emphasized that reparation must include public participation, cultural revival, and community-driven initiatives as instruments of transforming inequality. And this reparation festival exemplifies that vision. It turns art into a mechanism of memory, reparatory dialogue into music, and truth into collective performance. And while we address reparative justice, it is also important for us to look into the importance of intersectionality. And reparation cannot be understood excluding the idea of gender justice, climate justice, or even migration justice. And it's important that we remember Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, how she's highlighted the approach whereby discrimination tended to be understood and codified in a single axis perspective. And this approach of understanding the intersections while we analyze and while we address racism and racial discrimination or xenophobia, the gender approach is extremely important. And she articulated how such an essential approach made the sum and complexity of experiences of Black women who sat at the intersection between race and gender. Taking such approach, usually a single axis approach, erases Black women in the conceptualization, identification, and remediation of race and sex discrimination by limiting inquiry to the experiences of otherwise privileged members of the group. The same extractive systems that plundered African resources also exploited women, African women, girls, displaced African labor. And for reparation to mean something, the lives of these communities, migrant, rural women, indigenous people, LGBTQI plus African communities, must not be footnotes, but it has to be center stage. The intersectional approach in addressing reparatory justice should hold a center stage in the dialogue at the international forum, civil societies, in academic spaces. In the 2022 report of the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, it was very beautifully noted that culture must not only be preserved but liberated, particularly for communities who are historically silenced by racial and colonial domination. And liberating culture means freeing people from narratives that reduce them to trauma. It allows young African creators to define freedom in their own poetry, films, fashion, and community aesthetics. It is also important when we address reparatory justice, the process of healing, and engagements or festivals like this also amplifies the idea of healing, and which is a concept which is often neglected in the discourse of justice. Healing means confronting generational trauma, courageously looking at the wounds colonialism has left, and daring to ask, how do we love again, trust again, evolve again, and imagine again? And the UN Agenda for Transformative Reparation has highlighted the importance of psychological healing as both as an outcome and a tool of justice. And reparations must repair minds in communities, not only the material conditions. Reparations are not an African issue alone. They are a global human responsibility. The Caribbean Community CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice offers an inspiring model, and it demands, among others, indigenous peoples development, cultural institutions revival, and diaspora repatriation. And it reminds that from Kingston to Kigali, repair is a language everyone can speak. And in addition to the platforms at the United Nations, like the Forum for People of African Descent, which was established in 2021, is one such platform which has extensively focused on reparation. And the one of their report in 2024 has highlighted and reiterated that the moral legitimacy of reparation is no longer disputed. The question is implementation, and implementation demands not just policy but partnership among states, communities, and movements like those gathered here. And the UN General Assembly has also adopted a resolution establishing a second international decade for people of African descent, which represents quite an ambitious commitment to deepening and broadening global reparatory justice. And we hope that this new decade will build on past gains while aiming to achieve significant measurable impact on peace, justice, equality, and development for people of African descent worldwide. The second decade will focus on three recognized pillars: recognition, justice, and development. And recognition involves affirming the invaluable contribution of Afro-descendant to global history, culture, and development, while challenging and dismantling the systemic discrimination they face. And justice calls for accountability and reparatory measures that restore dignity, equity of African descent communities, and development prioritizes the creation of sustainable opportunities for social and economic advancement, ensuring no one remains excluded from the process. In the context of xenophobia, which is often sidelined while we talk about racism and racial discrimination, and it's also important to understand the true repair also involves dismantling historical injustices of colonialism. It also demands confronting the modern borders of prejudice, those social and political and cultural walls that separate Africans from one another within the continent. The intra-African xenophobia is not a peripheral issue. It is a growing crisis that echoes the legacies of colonial fragmentation and systemic exclusion. And to reform Africa, to repair Africa from the legacies of colonialism and enslavement, we also have to repair the bonds among Africans grounded in mutual recognition, respect, and collective purpose. The repair agenda that ignores intra-African xenophobia is an incomplete agenda. The trauma carried by displaced persons, mainly internally displaced over decades in regions like in Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, and Ethiopia, is something that needs a serious attention to address the internal crisis within Africa. We must also call for a fearless leadership that condemns xenophobia, racism, racial discrimination strongly, and foster education about Africa's shared history and design policies and protect the rights and dignity of people in the continent. In doing so, we answer the call to imagine Africa, where crossing borders within the continents is not met with hostility but with welcome, where the struggles of migrants and refugees are understood collectively, not weaponized, where solidarity born of shared histories empowers us to confront all manifestations of discrimination and exclusion. The solidarity between continents and its diaspora is an heartbeat of reparation, and the displacement of Africans through slavery and enslavement is one of the original globalization of injustice, and today we must globalize justice with the same determination. Today, when we speak of this gathering, this manifesto, I believe it will chart the course of the continent's struggle, hopes, and aspirations to intertwine with those African descendants in the diaspora. But the power of this manifesto will depend on its ability to transcend the written word to become moral compass that guides action, policy, and cultural renewal. As underscored in 2020 report of the United Nations Working Group on People of African Descent titled The Right to Culture as Right of Reparation, cultural expression is not merely accessory to justice, it is justice in motion. The working group called upon governments and international institutions to recognize that culture encompasses a fundamental human right integral to repair and healing. And in this sense, this festival manifesto is not only a political document, but a declaration of faith in transformative power of human creativity. It asserts that stories, art, music will continue to nourish justice, the truth and memory will not be silenced, and that healing in its richest cultural form will guide the policy and social renewal. Let us remember that justice is not static. It moves. Justice is art. It is never finished in a moment, but constantly remade in relation to the constant and creator. Because it is through the imagination of people of Africa beyond the continent and within the continent, combined with courage to face painful truth, and that we unlock the potential to transform societies deeply scarred by centuries of injustice into spaces of dignity, equality, and flourishing human spirit. Reparation today, it's fundamentally important because they address the deep multidimensional harm inflicted by centuries of slavery, colonialism, systemic racism, racial discrimination, particularly in critical areas such as health, land, education, and now even in technology. The legacy of dispossession in land ownership continues to deny many African communities their economic base necessary for sustainable livelihood, perpetuating the cycle of marginalization and poverty. Access to healthy living environment and equitable healthcare remains uneven. And reparation must therefore include restoring land rights, investing in healthcare system, and not only healing past, but also provide inclusive access to quality to healthcare, education, and reparation should address the importance of the idea of how the policies and documents can be translated into reality. Addressing the historical injustice involves not only enhancing the access to education, but also revising the curricula to include Afrocentric perspectives,
histories, knowledge system that have long been suppressed. And today's rapidly evolving global landscape, this educational reparation is vital to equip current and future generations to navigate and shape a just world. And reparation, therefore, must include active effort to mitigate certain risks, particularly in the context of technology. In the contemporary context, the emergence of artificial intelligence introduces a new urgency to the reparation agenda. AI technology, if left unchecked, risk perpetuating and amplifying the existing racial biases encoding into data and algorithms, further enriching the systemic racism and racial discrimination. Tackling racism and structural inequality at all levels, from health to land to education and technology, is not just a moral imperative but a practical necessity for building societies where everyone can thrive. As we close, I would like to mention one of the profound statements by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who is also known as the father of Indian Constitution and one of the tallest figures who worked for the empowerment of Dalits or the ex-untouchable community. And I quote, he says, "Ours is a battle not for wealth, not for power. Ours is a battle for freedom, for reclamation of human personality." Like Ambedkar calls for the reclamation of human personality, leaders such as Nelson Mandela emphasized that fight against colonial domination, to fight to restore dignity and self-respect to Black and African people. This festival, this movement tells the world we are done waiting. We validate ourselves, we testify to our own survival, we define our future on our own terms. Racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, exclusion conditions people to believe that some lives matter less, that some lives is inexpendable. But standing here among creators, visionaries, activists, I see the truth. The African spirit cannot be diminished, it only transforms. Let this Reparation Festival mark the dawn of a healed continent. Let it echo beyond Nairobi, across cities and continents, declaring that reparation are not just charity, they are humanity restored. Let every brushstroke, every poem, every song today whisper the truth that connects all of us. Wakati Wetu, it is our time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Please, let's give it up again for Dr. Ashwini K.P. Thank you so very much.
That was amazing. And now we're going to move on and we're going to have a response to the keynote. Please join me in welcoming another friend, another comrade, another colleague, Dr. Amara Enya. Dr. Enya holds and wears many hats, but for today, she's just going to be my friend who's going to respond to this keynote. Thank you very much and welcome, Dr. Enya.
Good morning, everyone. You know, we cannot be on the continent where there's a culture of call and response. And I'm going to go back to how I was raised because, you know, greeting is an important thing in the Igbo culture in Nigeria, and I'm sure it's a big thing here. So we greet people when we see them, and we respond, yeah? Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yes. Ademma. I see I have my people. I'm sorry, I heard my language beings, but yes, I love it. So my mother would be very pleased. You know, we learned some tough lessons back in the day when we didn't follow through with the cultural mandates. So I'm excited to be here. Again, my name is Amara Enya, and I have the pleasure of delivering a response to the insightful remarks that were just delivered by Dr. Ashwini. I first want to thank the organizers of this gathering. This is actually a historic moment for the continent. It's an historic moment for us. And so I want to express my deepest gratitude to my comrade, Makmid, who we've been in a few trenches together. and to see the work continuing. To Liliane, to Lavender, to so many of the folks who send the emails, send the notes, send those schedules, keep us on track, to the people who provide the food, the vendors, all of the parts that make this day and these couple of days that we're together possible. I don't want to even go 1 minute further without saying thank you for that work. Thank you for that effort and for your contributions to where we are today. I won't take up too much time. I just had a few reflections from Dr. Ashwini's remarks and coupling that with some of the discussions that took place yesterday, everything from the opening keynote to the breakout sessions, which just provided so much that I'm taking away from our time here. And so I'm grateful for the remarks to get us started this morning. There are so many key points to underscore, but I wanted to start by appreciating the intention by which Dr. Ashwini and other speakers throughout this gathering have been about defining reparations and how reparations is defined, what it is and what it entails, and even questioning the use of the term that came up yesterday. It speaks to the importance of precision in the naming of a thing. And I don't think that I have to tell Africans about the importance of a name, what we call things. It is not just what you call a thing. Every time a name is spoken, it invokes that person's destiny. It's a reminder of who and what they are. And so precision in the naming of a thing is absolutely critical. So the attention and intention about how we name and define reparations remains paramount. I say this to say that we must be vigilant about how reparations is characterized broadly, especially as our movement opens up and expands. Even over the last year, I've seen phrases, pay reparations. They're going to pay reparations to. I've seen give reparations. They're going to give reparations to. A party is giving reparations. These phrases reify the dynamic of condescension and charity, namely between the global north and the global south, at least most frequently between the global north and the global south. This is simply not an accurate take. It is not a comprehensive take of what reparations actually entails. And so we have to be constantly vigilant about how we are using the term, how it is characterized. And this will become increasingly challenging as our movement opens up and expands, which the goal is to open it and expand it. But that comes with additional work that we must take on to ensure fidelity to the definition of the term, what we are actually talking about. Reparations is not just between, it is amongst. It is not just external, it is internal. It is inter and intra community. It is inter and intra communal. And so this is important because it is not just between the global north and the global south, for example. Even within the global north, those who are familiar with, and Dr. Ashwini mentioned this, importantly, notions of xenophobia, it exists there. Even within the global north, there's still discussions and debates about whether reparations is actually a requirement, whether it should go forward. That also exists in the global south. And it is not just between colonial actors and those, and for example, on the continent. It is also between actual communities. Mm-hmm. There is something to be said about the relationship between the continent and the diaspora that does require healing, that does require accountability. And if we don't take that on, we will not be engaging in truth, to the point that was made yesterday. And this brings me to another point that Dr. Ashwini so thoroughly and necessarily described, and that I appreciate, which is the lifting up of the xenophobia that exists even within the continent. And again, we cannot look away from the phenomenon. I appreciate Dr. Ashwini lifting it up because she rightly calls out the blatant xenophobia in different countries. And Yvonne, yesterday in her remarks, so beautifully articulated that reparations begins with truth-telling, and that truth must be whole. After all, the half-truth is a lie. And so if we are not willing to fully and comprehensively confront these dynamics, we actually cannot move forward with any reparatory justice agenda. So it is required. We must expose the truth, which includes the wounds that manifest in part as xenophobia. There's a phenomenon which must be called out about the ways that oppressive systems and structures shape us, even involuntarily, even subconsciously. This is particularly important for those residing in the heart of empire. The ways in which we absorb the characteristics of these systems, even in our subconscious, the ways that those who are oppressed, even in the heart of empire, can still absorb some of the characteristics of empire. It is, in fact, in confronting these realities that we can more adequately contend with them. Some of these tendencies show up in movement space. They manifest as notions of Black capitalism, and that we will be okay once we are the ones with the whip in our hand. It manifests in a tendency to believe that adopting and assimilating into these very same harmful systems and structures will guarantee or assure our safety or security. It manifests in believing that othering is okay, that there is some baseline acceptable amount of oppression, and that as long as it's that group over there, we'll be fine. That scapegoating of others, whether immigrants, undocumented, however you want to characterize them, whomever can be blamed for a people's struggles or misfortune. We see those tendencies. And often it is the state that weaponizes others for their own purpose. Blithely and implicitly, and in some instances, in many instances, explicitly allowing for the scapegoating and othering to take place in order to obscure their responsibility for the present dysfunction. The state is often complicit in fostering this dynamic, this xenophobia. And this brings me to a point that I reflected on from Dr. Ashwini's remarks, which is the role of the state in the reparations movement. The threats of state capture and co-optation. We have very valid critiques of state infrastructure. There's a way that the state operates that always exists in tension with movement. And it always exists in tension with, and sometimes in contradiction to movement. There is an inertia which requires a constant battling when dealing with the state. And oftentimes there's a conflation of the state and the people within a state. And this is part of the complexity for what it means to live in a state, particularly on the continent where the states, by and large, were not our creation. The states were colonial experiments. If we talk about certain states like Nigeria was essentially a company, many of them were simply companies, economic formations for the benefit of colonizers. And so our relationship to the state must be constantly examined. There's this inertia, again, that exists, as well as the notion of bureaucratic violence when it comes to the state. This is to say, death by 1,000 Zoom calls, death by 1,000 white papers, death by 1,000 consultations, death by 1,000 protocols. This is what I call bureaucratic violence. We know that the state operates on a different time scale from our work, our urgent work as movement. And so what this means is we must be clear-eyed about what the state actually is. And while we have lofty ideals of democracy and the state, what is happening right now in the United States is showing the entire world, and I live in Chicago, which has been ground zero for much of what has been happening. It is showing the entire world the fragility of what they called democracy. It is showing the entire world the fragility of the so-called state, of the rights and victories that folks thought were won. the fragility of the so-called norms, the fragility of the current rules-based order in which no one is actually following the rules. But what this means for us, as we are clear-eyed about the state, is that we do not cede any territory. We are required to be in all of the spaces. That is a part of our responsibility as movement. All lanes must be occupied. It's a matter of identifying the lane that is appropriate to your particular work. We cannot afford to cede territory in this moment. And I'm glad that Dr. Ashwini talked about the multilateral mechanisms that are taking up the issue of reparations. I had the pleasure of working with a number of colleagues in 2021 on the last leg of this push to establish the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. Those of us know what was taking place in those final days before the vote and the last minute switcheroos that were being done and the shenanigans, as I call them, in that last push. And it's important to note that that mechanism is part of the lineage of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. And so we should give credit to, as we come upon the 25th year next year of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, this body, this mechanism is an outgrowth of that. And so in that last push to establish this mechanism, after the resolution was passed, a few of my colleagues said, we cannot let the mechanism be formed and then just walk away. We knew that it is up to us to actually test the hypothesis, which is to say that can this mechanism actually do what we need it to do? And so myself and a couple of others founded the International Civil Society Working Group for the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. And I still, till today, chair that working group. And it is now in its 4th year of operation, organizing civil society around this mechanism. Not because we believe that the United Nations is a space of liberation and it's a liberatory space. We are under no such illusion, but because of this notion that we do not cede any territory, we are required to be in all of the spaces, and we see that as a site of struggle, a site of contention. And so in mentioning these mechanisms, it has been satisfying, at least gratifying, to see the development over the last 4 years of that space. It is now the largest mechanism serving people of African descent. And that is in part due to the organizing of civil society to legitimize the mechanism. And I think it has to be clearly stated that the legitimacy of these mechanisms comes from the engagement by civil society and the grassroots. And so this notion of what our responsibility is at this time, I believe that the conversations throughout the course of this festival will illuminate what our mandate is in this moment, that the work that we're doing is not happening in a vacuum, that it requires exceeding vigilance, agility, and there was something that I want to leave everyone with as we think about where the reparations movement is going. And as an organizer, I was taught that the order of operations is our people first, our organization second, and ego is third, meaning last. Meaning what is required at this time is to focus on our people first and foremost. What are we doing by, with, for, alongside our people? How are we bringing our people along? Then our organizations, because we believe that we should be accountable to a thing. That sometimes when you have individuals out here moving, however, who are you accountable to? Who are your people? So it's organization second. And third, last is ego. We do not have the space for ego at this time, because the ways that we actually have to come together, the ways that we actually need to be in operational unity, the ways that we have to contend with battles on multiple fronts, there is no room for the ego, which actually creates insecurity and undermines our work. And so I wanted to leave us with those words and that call to action and call for internal reflection, because it will either help us advance our work or it will actually contribute to the barriers that we're already facing. And my hope is that we come out of this festival with a renewed commitment, not just to reparations generally, but a renewed commitment to each other and building the relationships on the continent and between the continent and the diaspora that are necessary for the world that we're trying to build. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much.